So you want to be like Caesar? Conquer Gaul? Cross the Rubicon? Become the most powerful man in Rome? Have your name turned into a word for emperor in half the languages on earth? That's what history remembers. Here's what it conveniently forgets. The debts so enormous, they nearly ended him before he ever held real power. The armies he led with no legal right to command them. The Senate that feared him enough to stab him 23 times. The son he never had, and the nephew he gambled the entire future of Rome on instead. Let's go back to one single night, 49 BC, a riverbank in northern Italy. A general stands at the edge of a shallow, unremarkable stream called the Rubicon. Behind him, one legion. Ahead of him, Rome itself, and a law that says any general who crosses this river with his army is committing treason. He knows the Senate is waiting. He knows Pompey, once his ally, now his rival, commands more men. He knows there is no clean way back from this. He crosses anyway. Alea iacta est, he reportedly says. The die is cast. Most people know this moment as the start of a civil war. Almost nobody asked the more interesting question. Why was Caesar, of all people, the one willing to do it? Forget the conquest for a second. This is about what was happening inside his head. Let's get to understand the handful of mental habits that show up again and again. In Gaul, in Rome, in the Senate, in his own bedroom the night before his death, and why those same habits that made him unstoppable were the ones that got him killed. Let's start with the one his enemies feared most, speed. In 52 BC, Caesar is fighting the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, a man who has finally figured out the one strategy that might beat Rome. Burn the land, avoid open battle, starve the legions out. It's working. Caesar's supply lines are stretched thin. His army is exhausted. Most commanders would consolidate, wait for reinforcements, play it safe. But Caesar does the opposite. He moves faster than anyone thinks is possible, force marching his legions across terrain his enemies assumed would slow him down, arriving at Alasia before Vercingetorix can finish his defenses. Then surrounded by a Gallic relief force on one side and a besieged army on the other, Caesar does something almost insane. He builds 2 rings of fortifications at once, one facing in, one facing out. He is besieging the besiegers. It works. Alesia falls. Gaul falls with it. This wasn't just tactics. It was a worldview. Caesar operated on a simple, brutal principle. Whoever moves first controls the story. Whoever hesitates gets written out of it. Later during the Civil War, he'd cross the Adriatic in the dead of winter when no Roman fleet dared sail, just to catch Pompey off guard. His own soldiers thought he was reckless. He wasn't reckless. He understood something most people don't. In moments of maximum uncertainty, speed isn't just an advantage. It's a form of information warfare. If your enemy can't predict where you'll be, they can't plan around you. They spend all their energy reacting to you instead of executing their own strategy. That single habit, act before the picture is fully clear, would define almost every major decision of his life. But speed alone doesn't explain Caesar. Plenty of impulsive men died young in Rome. There was another pattern hiding underneath it, and it's the one that made his boldness survivable. Caesar calculated risk the way a gambler counts cards, not the way a gambler chases a loss. Before he ever crossed the Rubicon, he'd spent 9 years in Gaul building the single most battle-hardened, personally loyal army in the Roman world. He knew exactly what he had. He knew exactly what Pompey had. He'd read the political temperature in Rome through a constant stream of letters and allies feeding him information. The Rubicon wasn't a leap of faith. It was a bet placed after years of quietly stacking the odds. This is the part the myth leaves out. Caesar's boldness looked spontaneous. It almost never was. Years earlier, as a young man, he was captured by pirates in the Mediterranean and held for ransom. The story goes that he joked with his captors, told them he'd have them all crucified once he was free, and they laughed it off as arrogance. He wasn't joking. The moment he was released, he raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, and had them executed exactly as he'd said. That's the pattern. Confidence that sounds reckless, backed by a private, almost obsessive follow-through most people never see. This is where his thinking becomes genuinely different from his rivals. Pompey and the Senate treated risk as something to be avoided. Caesar treated risk as something to be engineered. He didn't ask, "Is this safe?" He asked, "Have I made this as safe as it can possibly be? And is the reward still worth the danger that's left?" That distinction of engineering risk instead of avoiding it is the difference between a gambler and a strategist. But calculation only gets you so far. In a city like Rome, where public opinion could destroy a man faster than any army, that brings us to something almost nobody credits Caesar for. He was quite possibly the greatest self-mythologizer in ancient history. During the Gallic campaigns, Caesar did something no Roman general had really done before at this scale. He wrote his own war reports, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, and had them circulated back in Rome as he fought. He wrote them in the third person. Caesar did this. Caesar decided that. Cold, clean, as a matter of fact, like a neutral historian reporting facts rather than a general boasting about himself. That choice was deliberate. By removing the I, he made his own account feel like objective truth instead of propaganda. While Roman senators debated in marble buildings, Caesar was quietly writing the first draft of how history would remember him and getting the public hooked on it in real time, centuries before anyone would call this content marketing. Here's the uncomfortable insight underneath that. Caesar understood something most brilliant people miss. Being effective and being remembered as effective are two different skills, and you have to build both on purpose. He didn't just win battles, he controlled the narrative of the battles, faster than his enemies in Rome could counter it. But rewriting his own image wasn't only outward-facing. There was another habit, quieter, that shaped how he treated the people who beat him: clemency. Time and again, when Caesar defeated a Roman enemy, rather than executing them the traditional way, he forgave them, publicly and generously. Cicero, a man who had openly sided against him, was pardoned and allowed to keep writing, keep speaking, keep existing as a public figure. Many of the senators who eventually murdered Caesar in 44 BC had themselves been forgiven by him after fighting on the wrong side of the civil war. Think about how strange that is. Caesar's mercy wasn't just kindness. It was strategy dressed as kindness. A dead enemy becomes a martyr. A spared enemy becomes a walking advertisement for your power, someone who owes you their life and has to live every day inside that debt. Clemency let Caesar look magnanimous while quietly making half of Rome psychologically indebted to him. It was, in its own way, a form of leverage, which brings us to the pattern running underneath almost everything else he did. Caesar was, for most of his early life, drowning in debt. Historically enormous debt, the kind that would have ended most political careers before they started. Instead of retreating from it, he used it as fuel. He borrowed staggering sums to fund lavish public games, alliances, and campaigns, essentially betting his entire future on the idea that if he became powerful enough, the debt would stop mattering. It was terrifying. It was also, in its own brutal way, rational. Caesar seemed to understand, decades before anyone had a word for it, that leverage magnifies outcomes in both directions. And if you're confident in your own ability to win, debt isn't a trap. It's a tool. That mindset built his career. It also explains why he never stopped pushing for more territory, more titles, more power. A man who has bet everything on winning can't afford to stop climbing. And that's where all 6 of these patterns start to collide. His speed let him act before rivals could respond. His calculated risk-taking let him turn that speed into real, engineered gains instead of reckless losses. His mastery of narrative let the public fall in love with those gains before his enemies could spin them differently. His clemency turned former enemies into quiet debtors of his mercy. His comfort with leverage meant he never had a ceiling, only the next bet. Each pattern fed the next, and together they built something almost unstoppable. Almost. Because the same mind that calculated Gallic war logistics down to the day, that read Roman politics like a chessboard, made one catastrophic miscalculation. He believed his own clemency had made him safe. He dismissed his bodyguards. He ignored warnings about a plot. He walked into the Senate on the Ides of March, surrounded by men he had personally spared, convinced that mercy had bought him loyalty. It hadn't. It had bought him something more dangerous: proximity. The blind spot of a mind built on engineering outcomes is this. Eventually, you start to believe you've engineered the people around you too. Caesar had spent his life calculating armies, terrain, timing, and public opinion. He forgot that forgiveness doesn't erase humiliation. Sometimes it just postpones the reckoning. You don't need to conquer Gaul. You don't need to cross a river and start a war. But the next time you're standing at your own edge of some smaller Rubicon, a risky decision, a bold move, a moment where waiting feels safer than acting, it's worth asking what Caesar actually understood. Not that speed guarantees success, not that boldness alone wins, but that most people lose simply because they wait for certainty that never comes, while the ones who move, carefully, deliberately, with the odds stacked as far in their favor as they can manage, are the ones who get to write the story afterward. Just remember what happened when he trusted that story a little too much.